Hi everyone, and welcome to this Multilingual Matters online event, Ask the Authors Live. I'm Flo from Multilingual Matters. I'm joined by my colleague Laura, who's in the headphones. She's dealing with the technical side of Zoom for us. And we're delighted to be joined today by one of the editors of our Psychology of Language Learning and Teaching book series, Sarah Mercer from the University of Graz. We'll be speaking to a couple of the authors in the series about their books. Amy Thompson with her book, The Role of Context in Language Teacher Self-Development and Motivation, and Jieun Kiaer about her book, Young Children's Foreign Language Anxiety, which she co-wrote with Jessica Morgan-Brown and Naya Choi. At the end of the event, there will be an opportunity for the panelists to answer some of your questions. So if anything comes up during the event that you'd like answered, please do post in our Q&A, in the Q&A tool on Zoom. Probably earlier the better in the event so we can get through as many as possible. And Laura will be keeping an eye on submissions and we'll ask as many of those as we can. And we'll also be giving you a discount code for 50% off at the end, so look out for that as well. And now I'll hand over to Sarah, who'll give an introduction to the series and then ask Amy some questions to start.
Hi, thank you very much, Flo. It's lovely to be here. Nice to be with two authors. It's not as nice as when we meet in person at a conference, but this will have to do for the moment while we wait to be able to meet again in real. Welcome to today's session. It's really nice to talk with the authors. What we have is a series called Psychology of Language Learning and Teaching. And the series was designed to sort of foreground work on different psychological constructs, but specifically in the area of language learning and teaching. So looking at teacher perspectives, but also learner perspectives. And one of the things that we were really keen to stress when we established the series, that we wanted this to have different perspectives on psychology. And that's what's really fabulous about the two books today, is that they bring in such diverse perspectives and they have different backgrounds, different methodological approaches and different theoretical frameworks. And so that's kind of for us really rewarding to see how diverse the series is becoming in its content in terms of concepts, but also the sort of methodological and theoretical designs that run through the series. We are always looking for new books for the series. So if there's somebody out there that's got an idea, working on a topic that they think fits nicely, that interweaves psychology and language learning or language teaching, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and find out a little bit more about what you have in mind and see if it's suitable for the series. All books in the series are peer reviewed and they go through quite a process of application at the beginning, proposals, and then they are reviewed by experts from the field. So Amy and Jieun have already been through this long process. They've already gone through all the feedback stages, and that's why they've got two fantastic books that we're extremely proud of in the series, and I'm delighted to talk with you about them. Thank you for coming. Amy, I'm going to start talking with you first, if that's okay. Sure. Amy, do you want to tell me a little bit about your book, what it's about, and the background to how you came to put it together?
Yes, sure. And I just also will say, so the participants know, you can see me on the video on my computer, but I'm actually using the audio on my phone because of internet issues for where I live. So you'll see the yellow box lit up, which is not around the video that you see of me. So don't worry, they're both me. So certainly, so about the book, this was quite a fun project to do. And it was one of the projects that sometimes you start a project and you have a very definite concept of where the project is going to begin and the middle parts and what you're going to do and how it's going to end. This was not one of those projects, I would say. This book actually started, the information that I gathered, the conversations I had with the teachers started in my very first year as a faculty member at the University of South Florida, right after I had graduated from Michigan State. And it wasn't a project that I had intended to do even, but I was part of, in the spring semester of 2010, I was part of a mentoring program for teachers that were coming to USF for a program. They came from all over the world. And in talking with them, I almost felt that they were mentoring me rather than I was mentoring them. And so I had all of a sudden, I said, I have to record their stories. I mean, they're going to leave and go to all over the parts of the world, and I won't have a chance to do this again. And so I quickly did an IRB, which is the US version of the Human Subjects Permissions, and then basically talked to any of these teachers that wanted to talk with me, and with some general topics and themes in mind, but essentially I wanted to hear their stories. And so they were very free-flowing conversations with no sort of preconceived like really, like there were some topics, but not really preconceived like questions I had in mind. And so each of the conversations went in a very different way. So that's how this whole thing started. And then over 10 years later, here we are. I'm in a different state. I have a different position. You know, my career has gone in a different way. So that's how we began.
And they're a fascinating set of stories. They're lovely stories, and you've done a really great job in the book of bringing out the voices of these individual teachers. And I think that's what's so very special about the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the individual voices, but how you brought together the background information and the participant experiences?
Well, so this is very interesting. And I think the way that the book is arranged is there's the sort of the chapter 1, or the first part, has some theoretical background about, you know, motivation theory, some issues with multilingual teachers and these types of things. But then the bulk of the chapters are focused on specific contexts. And so, for example, there's, you know, a chapter on Turkey where 2 instructors and I were having conversations about their experiences about being English language teachers in the Turkish context. And so as I started reading this information, I realized that within the conversations if I wanted to tell the stories and have others also understand them, there was a lot of background information that needed to be included. And so I found myself in the basement of the library at University of South Florida, like sort of like peeling through like old dusty books that no one had, you know, touched in decades and decades, reading about the context myself, and then sort of trying to summarize it in a way that was both informative but also accessible to people that didn't really know much about the context at all. And then trying to contextualize the excerpts from the conversations we had, but with lots of background information so that everyone could understand that. And it was a fascinating process. And that's one of the reasons why it took a while for this project to be finished, because each context that I chose to include in the book, the final product, I had to really do a lot of digging. I had to go talk to other experts on these specific contexts, like in the history department, the language departments, to make sure that I was accurately representing the context that I wanted to include.
Yeah, I have to say there's a lot of rich detail, that not only about the individuals, but also about the context. I learned an enormous amount from reading the book. So it helps you to have a bit of sensitivity to the diversity of contexts in which language teaching takes place. And that's something that I found quite special. There are some themes that come out repeatedly in the book. Particularly, I think, issues about linguistic discrimination and prejudice, for example. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about those issues and how they relate to the stories that were told?
Sure. And again, not having a sort of specific themes that I necessarily wanted to bring up, I did find that in many of the conversations I had, this theme of, you know, feeling as society as a whole might not value these multilingual teachers teaching English because English was not their first language. And so we had some pretty fiery, I guess, maybe conversations around that topic. And certainly the excerpts that I included were very direct, but I also, you know, sent the chapters back to the participants and asked them to, you know, to read and to make sure that what I was including, that they also agreed on being included, those that I could still keep in touch with. But I think it's fascinating how these ideas of linguistic discrimination sort of were portrayed differently depending on the context as well. So while it was an underlying theme, it was much stronger in specific settings. So like I'm remembering the excerpts from the chapter about Vietnam and sort of the difference in pay between native English speakers who would travel to Vietnam, maybe without any pedagogical background or training to be teachers, but then actually were making more than the local Vietnamese teachers who were teaching English with all this background and training, which I know happens all over the world, and in some contexts is just more pronounced. And in fact, I think I talked in this chapter, in Vietnamese, there's a word which means backpacker teacher, which just basically means, you know, someone who happens to be at Vietnam stops by, teaches some English, and then goes on their way with no sort of dedication to the field or whatever. So I think this part, as I was reading the conversations over and over, and as we were also having some difficult conversations in the US context about linguistic racism, xenophobia, all these different issues, as I was trying to finalize this manuscript, I really wanted to sort of make it a focal point and bring out these issues, not only in the chapters themselves, but also in the preface and in the introduction.
Yeah, you do a good job of tying those different themes together. Do you want to talk a little bit about the role of motivation? Because that's kind of the main psychological construct that's the backdrop for the book. So if you want to talk a little bit about how that fits into the picture.
Absolutely. So the motivational framework that I was using in this book is from the L2 motivational. It is the L2 motivational self system, but specifically I was focusing on the ideal self, but within that, the ideal teacher self. So people's concepts of themselves and who they want to be as a language teacher. And what I found really interesting and really fun about this, and again, this, I think when I was having these conversations, for the most part, it was right at the beginning of the sort of the launch of the L2 motivational self system, and when it became very popular after the 2009 publication. And so this, again, wasn't, these weren't specific questions I was asking back in spring 2010 when I was having these conversations with the teachers. But what I found is that the sort of the formation of the ideal teacher selves in each of these contexts was very much intertwined with the context. So you couldn't separate the development of the ideal teacher self with the context in which these teachers were located. And also, though, the concept of this idea of linguistic discrimination. So in contexts where there seemed to be more of it, there seemed to be more of a pushback against it, if that makes sense. And so that also brings up a concept I talk about motivation, the anti-ought-to self, meaning that people step up to challenges, or, you know, if someone says, no, you can't do this, or you're not as good as someone else, it makes you even more determined to be as good as someone else and to do the thing precisely that someone's telling you that you can't. So this came out very vividly in the context of Turkey. I remember when talking with one of the language educators, there was a very interesting point in the conversation where he said, you know, I mean, the fact that these guys get paid 5 times my salary, and, you know, everyone thinks that they're better than me, you know, I think to myself, I'm better than them. I can do this better than them. And then I was determined to be better, right? And so these concepts also raised within the contexts where there was a sort of a higher level of linguistic discrimination, I would say.
Do you want to talk a little bit also about the issue of diversity in the book? Because I know that's a theme, it's on the cover, it's a theme that runs through the book. It's also something that makes the book very special, and that it looks at context that might not be so widely explored in research, for example. So do you want to talk a little bit maybe about the diversity element?
Sure. So when I collected more conversations than I included in the final version of the book. And so when I was sort of reading through all of these and deciding which ones to go forward with, one of the aspects I was examining was, well, if I'm looking up articles about motivation or the ideal teacher self or something like this, which contexts are typically represented and which ones do we really not hear much about? And so as I was going through and choosing the context chapters, I really was going through and saying, okay, well, we don't see a lot of like motivation research coming out of Vietnam. We don't see much coming out of Egypt. We don't really see much coming from South America. There is some, but not as much as contexts like that, you know, from Europe, for example, or from Japan, there's quite a lot, from China, there's quite a lot. And so I was purposefully then selecting participants to represent contexts that typically didn't get represented, and voices that oftentimes were left out of the conversation. And I was also trying to, I also, you know, I love aspects related to multilingualism. And so as I was reading through the conversations, I also then selected chapters where the participants talked about the sort of the interconnection of their different linguistic systems and how it related to their English language teaching, but then how languages were used outside of the classroom and the context. And so it just, the Senegal chapter is one of my favorites for this way, because Oh, that was such a fun conversation. I vividly remember having that back in spring 2010. And he's just talking about like the aspect of, well, everyone thinks I should speak French because I'm from Senegal, but they're surprised when I teach English. So there's some anti-Altu self happening there. But then we also got in a very fascinating, I thought, conversation about language status and which languages quote unquote matter, because his first language is Pular, but also he has to speak Wolof. He said, of course I do, because like everyone around me speaks it, so why wouldn't I? But that piece was left till the very end, almost as if in his mind, like, I mean, everyone just speaks these languages, but like educated people speak French or English or, these types of things. And so in that chapter specifically, and he was very good about then responding to questions I asked him via email. He sent back a whole bunch of really interesting details and updates from several years after we had talked. And so trying to then also be very clear in his mind the importance of the indigenous languages in the Senegalese setting as well. So those are some of the thoughts that went into choosing the different chapters.
Well, I'm sure you've whetted everybody's appetite now about these different chapters and the different contexts that you've got. Do you want to just say what your takeaway message would be? What would you want people, when they've read your book, what would you want them to have, some of the messages you'd like them to take away from having read the book?
I would say, I mean, there are many messages. In some, and I would like people to take away some of the aspects that I've personally and professionally been thinking a lot about these days. The first one is to value everyone's experiences, both their life experiences and their professional experiences. Also, recognize that discrimination, linguistic and otherwise, is alive and well. Recognize your own privilege and what that means in your specific context, and fight for those with less privilege than you.
Super. Thank you very much, Amy. It was lovely to talk with you, and we'll ask you some more questions from the audience at the end. Sure. So now we're going to go to a bit of a different context and a bit of a different type of research and different type of setting. June, it's lovely to talk with you now a little bit about anxiety, which, I'm not going to hopefully make you or me anxious about this. Do you want to tell us also a little bit about the background to the book and how you came to write the book with your partners?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm a little bit anxious. I think it's like speaking foreign language. I think so many people nowadays speaking English and basically speaking, another language. And it's kind of, I don't know, like whether there are people who don't feel any level of anxiety at all. I've lived in UK for 20 years. My main language is English. Still, I feel more comfortable speaking in Korean than in English. And it's kind of really at the heart of this book. And I thought, I'm an adult and I feel very much anxious. But what would it be like for young children? How would they cope with, the language pressure? And I was kind of also at the same time talking with my Jessica Morgan, my co-author, and she has taught English in South Korea for many years. And she shares some of her very kind of the experience that I have not ever come across in my life in Korea. That she said, some of she was teaching English in an immersion school, sort of English only institute in a kindergarten. And she said some of the children, like age 4 and 5, and were so stressed because of this English only situation. So some of them were losing their hairs. They were not able to speak. They were having depression and so on and so forth. It was totally, so expensive, special education what everybody in Korea wanted to give, but then the kids were so much suffering. The parents would, I don't know whether they would know about this in the beginning and were worried, but I thought this is not really, whether you learn language, whether you learn English. I mean, it's something I felt like, particularly when you're young, the motivation should be joy. You like it, so therefore you learn. But if you have to somehow, in order to master English language, if you have that, going through that, awful psychological stress and so on, and anxiety, that I realized that this is a real problem. And then kind of recently, and similar time, I was talking to many of my friends who was, one of them she was a linguist, but she told me that, well, I think immersion school doesn't work and I don't want to send my kid to the school, immersion kindergarten, but there's a great peer pressure that everybody sends their kids to English immersion kindergarten. So she said, well, I don't want to send my son to the school, but there's a great peer pressure in my local area, so I'm sending him to that local school. And I said to her, like, look, do you know what curriculum is there taught, or what they're going through? But I thought this was really and kind of very how should I say, strange social phenomena. But I guess one of the things that I'm talking about in this book about South Korean as a case study, but then I took very many other colleagues in China, Japan, and Singapore, and like pretty much like what one's called expanding circle, when actually English really does mean social capital. Like people really want to give them kids English education, boost up their English education as early as possible. But the way how they do it is like very much oppressive environment, and we're not really caring about whether the kids are happy or unhappy or feel anxious or not. So I really wanted to kind of, the first motivation of this book is to bring up this issue that, just as you are stressed or you feel anxious, your kids will be exactly the same way, anxious and feeling, not happy. And this is something we need to detect and act upon. Otherwise, that will affect the entire of their life, the rest of the education, but not just education or language learning itself, but, what you learn or experience in your young age could impact your entire life. So I thought this is something that I need to write and work on. And this is how the project started.
Well, it's a very good motivation to have. I mean, it's a very difficult context. And maybe you can describe a little bit about the context of Korea and young children in these schools. I've forgotten what the word is you call it. Is it English fever or something?
Yeah.
So maybe you can describe a little bit about that, because it's fascinating, perhaps for people who are unfamiliar with the context in which the research was done.
So the English fever means like sort of, I think you may have heard about education fever, like, and tiger mom and so on and so forth. Like, it's very much like probably East Asia and Southeast Asia, Singapore, and all very much like, known as education fever, like really hardworking mom and also hardworking children. But somehow this English fever means that basically the same thing, but putting so much emphasis on English language education and the kind of the sort of issues behind is that for children, the younger the better. Like if they're exposed in their young age, they will learn much quicker, and they will be able to learn English, be able to speak English really well. So they spend so much kind of resources, time, and also money in teaching English for young, particularly young children, English to the young children. And in the past, like about 10 years ago, and Koreans also coined this new term, something like very, I don't know whether this is the right term, but sorry, wild goose dad. So like, basically what it means that is dad stays in Korea and earns money, send the money to the moms and children who are in either, in any English-speaking country. So basically, this was a very, very serious social phenomena that, because for the sake of English language, many families lived apart, and that, the new terms started to even appear. But then, of course, sending people to other places like, to English-speaking countries, a bit more expensive. So the kind of alternative they found, they created, was this total immersion English school where they're not allowed to speak any Korean or anything else. Actually, Jessica Morgan, my co-author, she was able to speak Korean, but she was instructed not to speak a single Korean word to these Korean children, young children. So, she felt so bad. And I thought that when she shared that story with me, I thought this is something wrong. Of course, if you learn language young and learn, that would be fantastic. But if you learn language in such an oppressive way that you're not even able to, for these children, they're not even kind of, mastered, or, they're not really fluent in speaking Korean, but they had to speak all in English. And if they do not speak in English, they were disciplined, or sometimes, they had to, they were somehow punished by not speaking English. And that she said this is so much normal in any English kindergarten. And I, sorry, that made also that motivated me. But this is kind of very the situation in South Korea, but of course I think that maybe in other places too, very oppressive and immersion only, but at the same time, they don't really care about whether the curriculum or the enjoyment part is very much missing. But they were very much like sort of test-based, how many vocabulary they can learn, how many, what kind of score they can achieve. So it's kind of more based on that exam score, vocabulary, the number of vocabulary. It was very quantitative methods that they were interested in, not anything like their well-being or their enjoyment, anything like that. So I think probably that is what I can talk about the English education in South Korea at the moment.
It's quite, it's mildly depressing, but it's quite interesting in relation to what Amy was just talking about in terms of status and the pressures to learn certain languages and to conform and so on. So it does, you get to see how the psychological situation of these learners is very much impacted by the system. You can't talk about it without understanding the context. You just touched on something that I remember being quite an interesting sort of conclusion in the latter part of the book is, what do you see as this relationship then between this anxiety that the learners are experiencing, particularly because they're young learners, but also enjoyment? How do you see those two things as related?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we were kind of looking at this project more like, positive side. So we wanted to look at more like, how to increase their enjoyment rather than like focusing more anxiety, but at the end they became sort of more anxiety focused. But I think it's one of the things that I discuss show as a case study in this book is that we taught children, very 5-year-old children, how English vocabulary. One group we did just like without real kind of experience, but the other group are just looking at the photos and so on. The other group, they actually did some cooking. They were making some salad, and so the two different methods. The people, the kids who made salad and in cooking, they participate in cooking, they so much enjoyed, and the feedback was really brilliant. They said, I want to do it again. I so much like cooking. They were so happy. And not only they were happy, at the end, well, kind of what we found out that their score was better. Was the other group, they always said what they said was like, it's so boring, I don't want to do it. And they did it, but they didn't really enjoy it. And at the end, the score wasn't that great. I mean, of course, this is one case study, but what it shows is that if you can enjoy it at that age, young children, they can flourish and they can learn more. But if you're somehow oppressed to sort of very much like repetitive memorization and that old method, probably you may be good at very much short term, but for long term you may not have any enjoyment. And I think enjoyment in young age, that is so important, whether there's language learning or any other area. Someone like me, I only learned English language at the age of 12, but when I come to English language 12 years old, which is really late in our contemporary term, but I thought it's very much it's enjoyable thing. It's fun thing to learn a new language, and I think it's much better to have that experience rather than like 2 and 3 when there's sort of like many Gangnam rich area schools now teach Korean pronunciation because they were exposed to English pronunciations too early, so the Korean kids can't pronounce Korean. They can't speak Korean properly, so they have another institute where they go back now and to learn Korean pronunciation. And I thought this is all so wrong, and it's so unhealthy environment. So I mean, we can't just say that language anxiety and enjoyment to have some direct correlation, but I think basically the way how to decrease anxiety is by increasing enjoyment, and in this way I think everybody would be, the kids will have find it joyful, and then they will have more motivation to find out more and to be able to want to talk with the people in English language without much anxiety. That's what I think. Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting to look at this, the relationship between the two, because it just seems common sense to me that if you're enjoying all learning should be enjoyable, surely. And if you're enjoying learning, then you will learn more easily and you'll learn more. And also particularly in relation to language learning, you're more likely to be wanting to use the language. So perhaps you can talk a little bit then about sort of, thinking beyond the Korean context, but also what did you, because you did a lot of different studies, what did you learn about foreign language anxiety and how it relates to sort of maybe other psychological constructs and also social context? What are some of the lessons about these relationships that we can take about understanding anxiety?
Yeah, I think, like, first of all, I think people really, when I talk about foreign language anxiety, although there's a term in Korean language that what, the foreign language anxiety means, but very often this term or this notion of anxiety, language anxiety, normally meaning English anxiety, used for adults, not for children. Somehow people think that kids are okay. They don't think that kids can be stressed by language. Kind of the overall consensus in the society is that children will not get stressed by language. They will be able to pick up whatever they're given, and the more you give input, they will pick up and they won't have any problems. But I mean, there's so many sort of recent studies showing that this is not the case. The kids are so much stressed, and we need to give them, teaching English early. Fine, teaching English is a really good thing, but how we how we teach them is really important, and it's more important than probably in terms of like your curriculum, teach less but then make them to enjoy more. This should be kind of the philosophy, particularly when early years. That's what I think. But whereas I think most Korean moms and teachers altogether don't have this idea, but they wanted to give more, and they don't have sort of the idea about anxiety. I mean, so kind of one of the point of the reason why I wanted to write this book was to be aware, to raise the awareness about language anxiety, which doesn't just stop in language anxiety, but the case studies that we found, or the examples that we found, kids are depressed and they also develop sort of autistic behaviors. And, like it took ages for them to kind of recover from what they have experienced. So this is, and it's not like some few children who are unlucky, but when I kind of, particularly Naya Choi helped me to find so many data, but basically most children going to this expensive English kindergarten, they have this language anxiety, and they had to deal with this language anxiety along with other education, related anxiety. So kind of things that I wanted to point out to people is that it's not like simple thing that you can ignore. Well, so you can have it, but you will get over it. Even adults, I don't know, like people have anxiety, but all the time, it's not something that you can easily silence and forget about it. It comes back again. But kids, this language anxiety, which is kind of so much universal now in the Korean children across board, because everybody is exposed to very similar situation, is something I just wanted people not to ignore, but to kind of consider it important thing, and also to be proactive in terms of preventing children to have any mental to suffer from any sort of from the consequence of this language anxiety. I think it's one of the important thing I want to kind of bring up is that for example, like this, some of the parents, moms who were told about their children's particular strange behavior, which is caused by language anxiety. Most of them, first few sessions, they ignored it. They thought it's fine. My kids are fine. You are too sensitive, but she's absolutely fine. Well, actually, when she was not fine, but mom would say, "Oh, anxiety is nothing." I think the kind of the mentality that probably Korean parents or Korean moms have, like, my kids are okay, they're perfectly fine, and they will be able to cope with. But I think that is very wrong. One needs to kind of pick up any early signs and to proactively act to prevent any damage that can cause to the children, and somehow you make it much more enjoyable and less stressful. Yeah.
I think that's really valuable insights about the relationship that, how we teach has such an impact on the psychologist. That's why this book series, I know I'm slightly biased here, but that's why this book series is so important, is how we teach, the way we teach, the relationships we build with learners. That's just the foundation of how we learn, and also the memories we take and the identities we form, and thinking about Amy, the motivations, the sort of the whole sociology surrounding the experience. And so I think what's nice listening to both of you is there are a lot of parallels, looking at very different contexts, very different aspects of learning and different theoretical perspectives, but the importance of understanding the relationship between psychology and the social setting is just crystal clear in both cases. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to share your ideas and your research, and the books are both fantastic, and I've learned a lot from both of you, not only in the books that I've read, but also today. It was wonderful talking with you. I'm now going to hand over to Flo, who's going to deal with the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks both of you for that. It was really interesting. We've got our first question. This one's for Amy, from an anonymous poster, saying, did you identify any directed motivational currents that directly arose from a strong anti-ought to L2 teacher self?
Well, the short answer to that question is no, but I also didn't look for them. So that wasn't the focus of when I was deciding how to sort of go about the data analysis. I was not looking at DMCs. And the way that the conversations were, I mean, that they were controlled primarily by the teachers. And so that also meant that there wasn't, I wasn't sort of digging for information specifically to ask about. And at that point, actually, DMCs weren't a thing yet. So I couldn't have asked about it, even if I'd wanted to. What I did find were sort of very passionate expressions of like attitudes towards this idea of being a multilingual English teacher, and sort of bursts of energy, sort of fighting against the system who didn't value them as instructors as much as the system should have, probably. But what I didn't see in the interviews and these conversations was sort of a beginning point and then an ending point, which is one of the characteristics that really a DMC needs to have. It was the conversations were more of an overview of a whole career type of thing, and so it just didn't happen that we talked about things like that.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, do keep asking your questions. We're going to try and get through as many as possible. This is actually another one from an anonymous poster for Amy as well, who asks, in spite of the highly context-specific nature of your data, did you find any common themes in teachers' motivational systems that transcend the experience of native speakerism?
Yes, well, I would say yes and no. What I did see that was the sort of across all the contexts is that in every single context, these instructors were completely convinced, and rightly so, I think, that they would do a better job teaching the students in their context than someone who was a L1 speaker of English. And there are, in each of the chapters, there's a little bit of like expansion on that idea. And you will also see one of the other things, I was playing around a lot with like quotes and excerpts and how to use these like in a bit of a playful way in the book. And you'll also see that the chapter titles, with the context, there's an excerpt from the conversation that is the name of the chapter. So I'll just flip to the table of context here to give an example. I can't remember one offhand. So for example, for the one in Egypt. So the chapter 4 is Egypt : why is he comparing her to a summer's day? And so we had this whole conversation with this participant of, well, I mean, of course, like when you're reading Shakespeare in an English class and you're talking about how lovely the summer is, in Egypt, it's not lovely. It's hot and awful, and everyone tries to like be inside or like go to the ocean or the sea for, as much as possible. And so there was a lot of discussion in every single chapter. There were instances of this, like saying, I know my students better. I can teach my students better. And so despite these widely diverse contexts that I chose to include, I think that was the overarching theme in terms of the native speakerism aspect that I was exploring.
Sorry, unmute. Thanks, Amy. And we've got a comment with regard to autism in the Q&A that I think Gina's going to respond to for us.
Yeah, I think the comment is, yeah, thank you for the comment. Yeah, just to clarify what I meant was like not sort of developing kind of autism per se, but it was like developing autism sort of the traits rather than, the behavioral trait rather than, the developing, yeah, that was what I meant. So I think, thank you for the clarification. Yeah.
Thanks, June. This question is from Harry Singh Kaki, apologies if I mispronounced that, who asks Amy if she can suggest some tips to foster communicative competence in the EFL classroom and how to value their native languages so as they can raise students' awareness of the local languages and cultures in multilingual settings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very good question. Thank you. Well, so I would say that everyone you ask this question to probably would answer in a slightly different way. So there are I guess, a huge range of beliefs in terms of different language uses in language classrooms. And so one, actually, Sarah, it reminds me of the webinar we just had. I think it was it only last week? It seems like months ago, but there was a webinar that we also had in the discussion section that I was in charge of, was talking about individual differences in multilingualism and how that looks in in a language classroom. And so I think in that discussion, it came up that it's up to the instructor to raise awareness of other languages that may exist, not only in the context, but also in the minds of the learners, raise the awareness in a way so that learners are kind of cognizant of the idea that multiple language systems can exist within a person and also within a context. Now, that is a really tricky balance to do, I would say, because particularly when we're talking about communicative language teaching, and we need input, output, and interaction, right, in order for learners to be able to progress in terms of proficiency. And so the trick is to raise awareness of multiple languages, but while still having the students hear and produce and interact in the target language at appropriate levels. And that's really hard. And so what some language educators have decided to do is to disallow any other languages other than the target language in the classroom. I think ACTFL, the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, recommends that 80 to 90% of the class should be in the target language, right? If we're talking about languages other than English in the context of the US setting. However, that does leave a good 10 to 20% where even the National Teaching Organization for us is saying, I think it's sometimes reasonable and fine to bring in comments and discussions in languages other than the target language. And maybe then it could draw students in for them to be able to have conversations at a higher level cognitively than they would be able to have when they're trying to produce output in the language that they're learning. And so, I mean, goodness, they're also, I could keep going. I think I'll stop there, but essentially trying to raise awareness, trying to have students understand that different linguistic systems can interact, and no one language is more valuable than another language. And I think that also is a very important point to talk with students about, especially when we're in contexts where potentially there are languages that don't have a writing system, or that system has been lost and the language is primarily oral. Some languages that may be on the verge of extinction, to just say it money isn't the only thing, commerce and politics isn't the only thing that matters. We still need to value all the languages and make sure that no more of them die.
Thanks, Amy. This one is for June from Arnab Podder, who's starting PhD research on anxiety among pre-service teachers and would like to ask if your book, June, offers any insights for trainee teachers enrolled in teacher training courses. Oh, you're on mute, June.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think this is something probably not only in the Korean, South Korean context, but English sort of teachers should be aware of, given that so many kids now come to primary start school not from the background of English only background, but they come with all very much diverse language background. Once when my daughter was in school, when she was the reception, she had a friend who was Chinese, and she just arrived from China, and she didn't know what to, she basically, didn't know how to communicate. Her mom just sent her to the classroom, but nothing. And the way how she communicated with her teacher, when something, she really wanted to communicate, she screamed so much that, and the teacher and everybody didn't know what to do. And, they were, they didn't want, they can't learn language, and she was frustrated, and the teachers were very frustrated. They didn't know, and they were in trouble. So at the end, I had to kind of come along, and also I had to come with my student who is studying Chinese to kind of help her to be able to understand what is going on. And she didn't have any sort of problem. She was fine, but just simply her screaming, her language anxiety was expressed as scream, and the teachers didn't have any idea how to help her or how to approach this situation or anything. I mean, probably that's kind of a little bit extreme, but what I'm trying to say is that probably now that there's so many kids come up with a different language background, that the teacher should be able to understand, the very basic language anxiety, how, for example, like how can we detect language anxiety? How should we then help them to overcome language anxiety? I think these things probably something that probably for young children, this is very, very important, and it could be very much easily, it could bring some misunderstanding when actually it was just language anxiety. So I think it's something that I really think that should the curriculum or teacher training course, or they should be aware of this side, and to kind of be prepared, but also to realize that there's this dimension, psychological dimension of children who are exposed to the new language environment, that is not ever every day happy because they are children and they can learn, play in the playground, but this is something that they also have to struggle inwardly quite hard and to be able to find a solution. So I think this is something that I think in the future should be taught, or should be discussed as an important part of the course, just because I think it's changing so much that nowadays so many children, like in my small classroom of my daughter, is 30 languages spoken, and you see, wow, it's so much that multilingualism in reality. So I think teachers should be aware of this havoc with this difficulty, and be prepared and in the future.
Thank you, June. There's another question for Amy. Given the importance of language learning experience in the L2 motivational self-system, did you find that the teacher's previous learning experience was an important dimension in the teacher's motivation?
Yes. So yeah, this was interesting. And I don't remember if we extensively talked about it in all the conversations of the contexts, but I do vividly remember some of the conversations of the discussions as a learner, and how that then affected their ideal teacher selves as a language educator. And so I'm thinking back to a few different examples. I believe it's the chapter on Ukraine, where there's a discussion about the Russian instruction that took place. And certainly, like, to contextualize, I mean, this was all of the chapters required a lot of contextualization, but this was also, these instructors were learning English, well, first learning Russian and then learning English when the sort of Russian was forced upon the population of Ukraine. And so there were some very, very negative and vivid memories of the Russian instructors, who then, when the decision was, okay, we're not going to teach Russian anymore, we're going to de-emphasize it within the Ukrainian context, then all the Russian teachers became English teachers, right? Like overnight, they just said, okay, you're not teaching Russian anymore, you're going to teach English now. And so discussing the sort of that switch, and how the Russian teachers were upset that now they couldn't teach Russian, they were teaching English, and how it kind of made it a bit of a miserable experience. Nonetheless, then, I mean, and in that way, it motivated these language educators to be quite very communicative, like offering classes that were fun and engaging, and kind of, again, the anti-auto self aspect came out in that way. I remember the Estonian language educators talking about how amazing it was that their English teachers were able to teach them English behind the Iron Curtain, and saying, all we had were some old cassette tapes. Our English book was in Russian, and some shaky BBC radio waves that we could sometimes access. And those were all the materials we had. And so they talked about the deep respect and admiration they had for their own English teachers that taught them English during these really challenging times. I also remember the Senegal participant talked about how he really didn't like English until university, because he didn't find it engaging, he didn't find it fun, and then all of a sudden he took a university class and everything changed. And so certainly, I think in all of the contexts, there was some discussion, whether it made it into the chapter or not, about how the language learning aspect then affected their ideal teacher selves. Those are just some examples.
Thank you, Amy. We have what I think might be our last question, unless anyone else has any burning questions to ask us between now and when this one's answered. But Maria Nilsson asks if June could expand a bit more on her data collection process.
Yes, so basically, my colleague Naya Choi, she's in South Korea, so she collected the data, and also I collected some of the data with with Jessica Morgan, and those data sort of more some of the data we found or pseudonyms, but that was our own experience, the data we collected from our own experience. But Naya Choi interviewed 473 mothers. This was kind of largest studies in South Korea, so mothers and also the teachers. So that was that's done for over a year, and it was data collected in South Korea. But also we tried to there was a kind of one aspect of the study we wanted to know how we could actually whether we could talk to kids and then to do some more psychological study in order to test or to measure their stress level. And so we kind of come up with a different method and testing ways. But then at the end we thought this is too much for them. They may be stressed by for us bringing some sort of testing their saliva and the cortisol level, and we didn't want to cause extra stress for them because that would be not what we tried to do in the first place. So at the end we only interviewed the moms and teachers, and that was how we collected the data.
Thank you, June. We do have another one that's just come in. This one's for Amy. From Patty Ash Alakara Vizcara, who would like to know about anxiety coming from English teachers as well. How can we encourage English teachers in these stressful online times?
So specifically about, let me, if I can just clarify. So are you asking about these participants specifically, or just in general about anxiety and language teaching?
It looks like a general question, I think.
Is it general? Okay,
yeah, I think so.
I could also talk quite a long time about this. I'll try to limit myself. I know we all have to go, but so a little bit of background about me is also that I'm currently the department chair in the Department of World Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at West Virginia University. And so this is absolutely something that we have been talking about all year in our department meetings and having discussions about it, not only from the student perspective, because certainly there's quite a lot of student anxiety in terms of online teaching, but also the faculty anxiety as well. And so what I have been trying to advise the faculty in my department this year is, first of all, certainly this pandemic took everyone by surprise, and no one planned on needing to teach language online for these past 18 months or so. So I think an email that I just sent to the faculty said, remember, have understanding and grace, not only for your students, but also for yourself. So all of us, we have people who are professional instructional designers who have had years of training to be able to teach effectively online, where all of us this year have had to then assume those hats or take on those roles as instructional designers when maybe many of us didn't have that background needed to do it and feel as comfortable as we probably could have with more training previously. And I would also say, interestingly, we did in our department these past 2 semesters, we did some data collection and some assessment of the students enrolled in the online classes. And we were actually surprised to find that a lot of the students found the instructors were doing an excellent job. And I would say that's not just the case for the instructors in my department, although, I'm biased because my department's awesome, but I would say that is absolutely the case for instructors worldwide. I think language instructors are some of the kindest, most generous, most hardworking people that I know. And I think that perhaps this year, everyone is also being too hard on themselves. And so I am here to tell you now that you all are doing a great job. Feel proud of what you've done, feel proud of yourselves, and know that your students appreciate you, your institutions appreciate you. And well, I was going to say something profound at the very end, but I couldn't come up with something else. Anyway, you are appreciated. Your hard work is paid off, and your students have continued to learn despite this incredibly trying time.
Thank you, Amy. June, I don't know if you want to add anything to that at all.
I think this is kind of, this sort of pandemic situation somehow brought a new reality about, language learning too. But I don't know whether from young children's language learning point of view, whether, you know, something that we do in the sort of online language learning, whether that somehow to some children also had impact that is decrease some sort of anxiety, but able to enjoy what they learn more. So I don't know whether, you know, that's something also, of course, that we need to, you know, do more study, but I think it's something also the virtual learning had some impact to children, and a certain way, you know, negative, a certain way also the positive. And I think it's somehow, you know, some, you know, very shy children, for example, like, you know, doing in online, they can learn quietly rather than being able to, you know, rather than speaking up and to try to, so I think express themselves very much explicitly. So I think from language anxiety point of view, I think virtual learning had some interesting impact compared to the physical learning. So I think that would be something that would be very interesting to look at more.
And I think, interestingly, also, some people discovered they quite liked learning languages online and found that actually they were less anxious. And so this was about 1,200 students responded to our request to give us some feedback about our online learning last semester. And I think we've learned a lot from it, and we're going to take this feedback that we've gotten, and we're going to take the tools that we learned this year, and we're going to then make our language classes even better in the future. So even though this year was like terribly stressful, and certainly we wish it never happened, I think the silver lining aspect of it is we have so many now more tools and capabilities than we had at the beginning of this. And I think language learning and teaching will improve because of it.
Thanks, Amy. Sarah, I don't know if you have any final thoughts before we wrap up for today.
No, I can just see lots of potential for new books and new research. So it sounds very exciting to me.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all our panelists for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And to all of you watching from home as well, and your questions were brilliant. We really hope you enjoyed the event, and you can get 50% off on our website, any of the books in the series with the discount code PLLT2021. Thanks very much for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.